We've all been lied to about the ancient history of the Americas. History has long been shaped by gaps in our knowledge, gaps in the archaeological record, and gaps in the ancient oceans that once seemed impassable. Yet in recent decades, discoveries in Polynesia and South America have closed some of those gaps, showing that humans were far more mobile than once believed. If South Americans could cross the Pacific and leave their mark on Easter Island, then perhaps a similar episode unfolded in the Atlantic. Perhaps Phoenician sailors, with their unparalleled mastery of the Mediterranean, once crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Upon reaching the lush Gulf Coast of ancient Mexico, they encountered the Olmec, a people already building cities, domesticating crops, and studying the stars. And perhaps they returned to Egypt, not alone, but with a small retinue of Olmec rulers and temple architects. What followed was not conquest, but communion. Egyptian ideas and symbols fused with Olmec genius. The result was a sacred architecture born of two worlds. In the early 1990s, a German toxicologist, Dr. Svetlana Balabanova, made a discovery that shook conventional assumptions about the boundaries of the ancient world. While testing the hair and tissue of Egyptian mummies, including that of Henut Tawi, a priestess from around 3,000 years ago, she detected unmistakable traces of chemicals from the tobacco and the coca plants, two alkaloids considered exclusive to plants native to the Americas before the age of Columbus. These findings seemed impossible. The coca plant grows only in the eastern foothills of the Andes of South America. Tobacco is also native to the New World. According to all established historical models, ancient Egyptians could not have had any access to these substances because there were no known trade routes linking Africa and the Americas before 1492. Yet, Balabanova's results were consistent. Multiple laboratories confirmed her findings in several separate tests, despite fierce criticism from mainstream archaeology, which attributed the results to contamination or misidentified compounds. No alternative explanation has adequately accounted for the quantities and specificity of the alkaloids found. If authentic, these results imply a trade route or contact between ancient Egypt and the Americas more than 2,000 years before Columbus. This is where a bold but plausible hypothesis arises, that the Egyptians did acquire coca, but not directly from South America. Instead, it was through a transatlantic trade network involving Phoenician sailors and the Olmecs of Mesoamerica, with the Canary Islands serving as a vital staging point. One line of evidence used to suggest no evidence of contact is the fact that American cultivated plants were not grown in ancient Egypt, but the answer why is obvious. Totally different climates and the drug trade was much more lucrative. The Phoenicians wouldn't bring back live plants or seeds anyway, only the dried product for sale. By 3,000 years ago, the Phoenicians were the most accomplished mariners in the ancient Mediterranean. Based in cities like Tyre, Sidon, and later Carthage, they built strong, deep-hulled ships capable of long ocean voyages. Their legendary navigation skills and trade ambition pushed them beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, down the West African coast, and possibly into the Atlantic itself. The Canary Islands, lying just west of Morocco, were likely known to North African and Phoenician sailors as early as 3,200 years ago. These volcanic islands would have provided an ideal last port of call, offering fresh water, shelter, and food before venturing westward across the ocean. From the Canaries, the Canary Current and northeast trade winds would have carried Phoenician ships directly toward the Caribbean, on a path later used by Columbus. It is here, along the lush Gulf Coast, that they arrived at La Venta, capital of the Olmec civilization, and the largest trading port in the Americas at the time. The trade winds were favorable around 3,000 to 2,500 years ago, the same time as the Egyptian cocaine mummies, suggesting a trading timeline. The oldest pyramids at La Venta, known as the Great Pyramid, has a design and layout which closely matches Egyptian pyramids. This design likely influenced the building of the much larger pyramids of the Sun and Moon in the Valley of Mexico. This pyramid of La Venta is not as well known, but is much older, having been built around 3,000 years ago. The Olmec, like the Egyptians, also practiced skull elongation. Could this practice have originated in Egypt and been transferred to the Americas as well? Although cranial deformation was practiced long before this time, The extreme elongation seen in Egypt and Peru both occur around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. The Olmecs were the mother culture of Mesoamerica, known for their colossal stone heads, jade artistry, pyramids, and complex spiritual worldview. By 3,000 years ago, La Venta was a thriving ceremonial city. The Olmecs controlled extensive trade networks reaching into Central America and possibly as far as northern South America, where coca was cultivated. The Phoenicians, arriving with gold, incense, and Tyrian purple cloth, would have presented their goods as sacred and mysterious. In exchange, they may have received ritual items the Olmecs themselves acquired from the Andes: coca leaves, spondylus shells, psychoactive powders, and symbolic feathers. While the Olmecs may not have used coca themselves, they could have acted as middlemen, trading Egyptian or Phoenician luxuries southward to Andean cultures like the Chavin, and receiving coca in return. To the Egyptians and Phoenicians, purple dye was a sacred and royal substance. Produced from the murex sea snail, Tyrian purple was so rare and labor-intensive that it rivaled gold in value. It was considered the flesh of the gods and worn only by royalty, priests, and the dead. To the Olmecs, who prized jade above all, this radiant purple cloth may have been perceived as divine, a material that shone with supernatural energy. In return, the Phoenicians could have acquired small, dense, high-value ritual goods. Dried coca, extremely light and compact, would be perfect for long-distance trade. If a single Phoenician ship could carry 10,000 kilos of cargo, it could easily hold thousands of coca bundles along with other valuable items. These could then be transported back across the Atlantic via the Azores Current and Gulf Stream and eventually reach Egyptian pharaohs seeking powerful and exotic materials for psychotropics and healing. The presence of these substances in mummies, therefore, could be the archaeological echo of this forgotten trade. A round-trip voyage between Egypt and Olmec territory via the Canary Islands would have taken approximately 8 to 10 months of sailing time, not including time spent in ports for trade, resupply, or repairs. When accounting for weather patterns, rest periods, and trade negotiations, the entire journey could reasonably span 12 to 14 months, making it a year-long transatlantic expedition, well within the capabilities of ancient maritime planning. With optimal trade winds, they could have made one round-trip voyage every 2 years, with a long layover in the Americas. This theory, while speculative, is grounded in circumstantial patterns that cannot be dismissed. The Olmecs were not imitators. They were brilliant engineers, astronomers, and artists. Their colossal heads, ceremonial centers, and sophisticated urban plans emerged independently. But that does not preclude influence. Cultures grow in dialogue with others, and subtle exchanges, especially of spiritual and architectural knowledge, can leave lasting imprints. What if the pyramidal platforms of San Lorenzo and La Venta echo a memory of Egyptian sacred design? What if the solar alignments and star temples of Mesoamerica, so reminiscent of Egyptian rituals, are more than coincidence? To understand how such a connection could have occurred, one must begin with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, who rose to power around the same time as the Egyptian power was fading, were the greatest seafarers of the ancient Mediterranean. They built robust, seaworthy ships using advanced carpentry and sail designs, traded as far west as Spain, Morocco, and the Canary Islands, circumnavigated Africa, according to Herodotus, founded Carthage, present-day Tunisia, which became a massive naval power in the western Mediterranean. They were obsessed with secrecy, particularly about trade routes, meaning they may have hidden knowledge of ocean currents or long-distance voyages. If any Mediterranean people could have reached the Americas, even accidentally, it was them. Some believe they reached the Azores. It's not implausible to imagine one of their expeditions blown off course by a storm, drifting westward along the equatorial currents, and eventually landing on the shores of the Yucatan or Veracruz. Why couldn't they cross the Atlantic between West Africa and South America, which is less than 2,000 miles? We aren't saying that Egyptians literally build the pyramids of Mexico, but what if Egyptian engineers gave a helping hand in the design, in the mathematics of construction? We know that all cultures are influenced by outsiders, so this shouldn't be an idea that is controversial. What if a delegation of Olmec architects and engineers traveled to ancient Egypt where they were inspired by the pyramids and spent months learning how they were designed and built, then returned with this new knowledge? Skeptics argue that such a voyage would have been impossible. They say the Atlantic is too vast, the risk too great, and the technology too primitive. But that argument has already been disproven in the Pacific. For decades, mainstream scholars dismissed the idea that ancient South Americans could have reached Easter Island, or that Polynesians could have traveled the opposite direction. And yet, the evidence is now undeniable. In recent years, genetic studies have confirmed that native South Americans, almost certainly from Peru or Ecuador, reached Easter Island between 1150 and 1300 AD. Their DNA is present in the descendants of Rapa Nui, and it did not arrive with Europeans. Even more striking, the exchange appears to have gone both ways. Sweet potatoes and cultural elements made their way across the Pacific, suggesting repeated contact and influence. That means that ancient Polynesians crossed over 2,500 miles of open ocean, without compasses or maps, and they did not simply vanish. They influenced the island's religion and iconography, possibly helping to inspire the carving of the massive Moai statues, which, like those of the Andes, represented ancestors and sacred beings standing between the world of the living and the gods. In fact, there are undeniable similarities between Tiwanaku and Easter Island, including many aspects of the statues and the religion. So, if the builders of Tiwanaku allied with Polynesians and sailed 2,500 miles to an uninhabited Pacific island 800 years ago, around 1200 AD, then what would stop the Phoenician from partnering with Egyptians and sailing across the Atlantic? If ancient Peruvians could sail from South America to Rapa Nui with Polynesians, as recently proven by ancient DNA showing that 10% of pre-Columbian Easter Islanders have Peruvian DNA, shaping religion and stonework in the process, then why should we believe that the Phoenicians, perhaps the greatest mariners of the ancient Old World, could not have done the same across the Atlantic? The distance from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean is roughly equivalent to the stretch of Pacific Ocean between the coast of Peru and Easter Island. In fact, the Atlantic crossing may have been easier, aided by the predictable trade winds and the Canary Current. Columbus himself used these very currents to reach the Americas in 1492. The Phoenicians, with their deep-sea vessels and long history of sailing into the Atlantic in search of wealth and trade, knew the Western Ocean. They reached as far as Britain, Morocco, and possibly the Azores. Their descendants in Carthage sent expeditions down the West African coast. It is not only conceivable, it is plausible that one or more Phoenician voyages went farther than we ever imagined. And if such a voyage occurred, driven by exploration, trade, or manifest destiny, it is no more far-fetched to believe that a small party of Egyptians' temple architects might have accompanied them. The Egyptians and Phoenicians were deeply intertwined through commerce and ritual. Egyptian ideas could easily have passed into Phoenician hands, and if a voyage to the west was undertaken with sacred purpose, there is every reason to believe that they might have joined in pursuit of spiritual opportunity in a new land. In this light, the Olmec ceremonial centers with their pyramidal mounds, star-aligned temples, and ritualistic plazas become more than just indigenous triumphs, which they undoubtedly were. They also become possible reflections of an encounter, a meeting between an ancient American civilization and voyagers from across the sea, bringing nothing but ideas, reverence, and stone-carving techniques whose echoes stretch back to Giza. If South Americans shaped the stone religion of Easter Island, then Phoenicians and Egyptians may have left their breath, not their empire, not their rule, but a whisper of their vision, on the stones of La Venta. If Vikings crossed the perilous North Atlantic over 1,000 years ago, a total distance of over 2,000 miles, and landed in Greenland and Canada after stopping over in Iceland, and done this many times, then surely a similarly advanced seafaring culture could cross the warm central Atlantic and make it a round trip. Imagine then a Phoenician galley around 3,000 years ago, seeking new sources for wealth and trade, or driven by wind and wave into the unknown sea beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Weeks pass. The stars shift. Landfall is made on a humid coastline where maize grows high and strange glyphs adorn stone altars. The Phoenicians have found the Olmecs. But the Olmecs were not savages waiting for civilization. They were already building urban centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, with drainage systems, massive stone sculptures, and ceremonial complexes aligned to celestial bodies. The Phoenicians, recognizing the advanced nature of these people, may have engaged in trade or ritual exchange. They may have learned more than they taught. However, they also brought stories. The Phoenicians knew Egypt well. They traded with the Nile for over 1,000 years. Byblos was practically a colony of Egypt during the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Egyptian priests had visited Phoenician temples. Amulets, scarabs, and hieroglyphs found in Levantine graves speak of deep religious interchange. So when the Phoenician crew returned to the Old World, perhaps they carried tales of a land beyond the sea, lush, fertile, and sacred. And perhaps, among those who listened, a few Egyptian sages or temple builders heard echoes of divine purpose. Why would Olmec priests want to travel to a foreign world? The answer lies in their cosmology. Olmecs believed in sacred geographies, just like the Egyptians. The idea that the gods manifested in different places and that temples mirrored the cosmos. If tales of a Western land aligned with star law, solar cycles, or sacred rivers reach their ears, it is possible that a small sect of mystics, architects, or initiates saw a calling. Perhaps they believed they were destined to bring cosmic order to the distant world of the setting sun. The second voyage, then, would be no mere new venture. It would be a transatlantic trade route. A joint Phoenician-Egyptian expedition, likely larger and more intentional, crosses the Atlantic with the help of steady trade winds. They land again in Mesoamerica, near the Yucatan coast, where Olmec civilization was then flourishing. The Egyptians and Phoenicians would not have arrived as conquerors. They would have arrived as guests, foreign but bearing symbols, rituals, and ideas that resonated with the Olmec worldview. This is where the theory finds its heart. Not in claims of cultural superiority or replacement, but in mutual enrichment. The Olmecs had already aligned their ceremonial centers to Venus and solar solstices. The Egyptians too worshipped celestial cycles. Both revered the serpent, the Olmecs through the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, the Egyptians through the Uraeus cobra. Both honored the divine role of rulers, deified in death and tied to the heavens. When two such systems meet, convergence is not unlikely. Architecturally, the Egyptians would have shared sacred ratios, layout principles, and ideas about axis mundi, the world axis between heaven and earth embodied in temple pyramids. Egyptian temples were not just tombs, but stages for cosmic drama, with chambers aligned to solstices and equinoxes. The Olmec pyramid mounds may reflect an infusion of such ideas: sacred stairs, elevated platforms, and ceremonial altars that mirror the horizon and the sun's path. What emerged was not Egyptian architecture in Mexico, but something new. The Great Mound at La Venta, for instance, is not a replica of Giza, but it shares its axial alignment and its symbolic centrality. The complex is laid out along a north-south axis, aligned with celestial events. The use of basalt columns, massive stones, and symmetrical plazas recalls both Egyptian and Phoenician design sensibilities. And the buried offerings, serpentine masks, jade figurines, and symbolic arrangements suggest a sacred grammar of ritual space that could have been influenced by shared esoteric principles. Skeptics may ask, where is the evidence? But one must remember the fragility of evidence in the face of time and climate. The Phoenicians wrote on papyrus and perishable materials. Egyptian sacred scrolls were considered too holy to be spread casually. And if such a journey occurred only every other year, for 100 years or so, and in peaceful exchange rather than conquest, its physical traces would be ephemeral. We should not expect stone inscriptions in Phoenician script in Mexico. Instead, we should look for convergences of thought, patterns too precise to be dismissed as coincidence, but too subtle to constitute proof. This brings us to the Olmec heads, the colossal basalt sculptures that have stirred endless debate. Some claim they depict Africans, but this is not necessary. The facial features are consistent with local populations and may represent specific Olmec rulers. The heads are indigenous in origin and meaning. What is more intriguing, however, is the lack of body. The heads may represent a decapitated spiritual focus, a tradition also present in Near Eastern and Egyptian ritual art. The Egyptians sometimes built colossal heads of gods and kings, detached from bodies, as symbols of divine sight and eternal presence. Could this be another case of symbolic convergence? One must also consider the role of astronomy. Both Egyptians and Olmecs revered Venus, the morning and evening star, and built temples aligned to its cycle. The 584-day Venus cycle was critical in Olmec calendrics, just as the heliacal rising of Sirius was central to Egyptian ritual. When cultures on two sides of the ocean align their pyramids and festivals to the same celestial bodies, it raises the possibility of shared cosmological models. These models, if not transmitted directly, may have emerged through the subtle exchange of ideas during a brief but potent contact. Skeptics argue that such a voyage would have been impossible, but the same was once said of Polynesians reaching South America. That idea was dismissed for decades, until genetic evidence and sweet potatoes proved it true. Polynesians not only reached the coast of South America, but they brought South Americans back with them. The presence of Native American DNA in Rapa Nui proves the point. Prehistoric transoceanic contact is not only possible but documented. If Peruvians and Polynesians could cross the Pacific, why not Phoenicians and Egyptians across the Atlantic? The key is to recognize the asymmetry of history. Not all contact leaves obvious traces. Some cultures arrive, share, and vanish into the mythos of the land. Others integrate subtly. The Egyptians did not colonize Mexico. They did not impose their gods or rule as pharaohs, but perhaps they taught. Perhaps they advised. Perhaps they whispered secrets of stone, sun, and spirit to a civilization already rich with its own genius. By 1500 years ago, Olmec civilization faded, giving rise to the Zapotecs, Maya, and others. If Egyptian ideas lingered, they did so as fragments, reflected in pyramid temples, in funerary customs, in starlit calendars, and perhaps in the enduring Mesoamerican concept of sacred duality, sky and earth, life and death, sun and moon. Egypt had long revered duality through gods like Isis and Osiris, night and day, desert and Nile. When two cosmologies meet, they do not always clash. Sometimes they mirror. In the end, this theory does not propose that Egypt built the Olmec pyramids. It proposes that the Olmecs were the builders, but that one distant day, across one vast sea, an old traveler arrived bearing stories of a land where gods walked in temples of light, where stone aligned with stars, and where the soul of the sun rose and fell in sacred rhythm. And perhaps the Olmecs listened. And perhaps they saw themselves in those stories. History is not made only of proof, it is also made of possibility. And if we accept that Polynesians and Peruvians crossed oceans, then we must admit that a voyage from Phoenicia to Veracruz is not impossible. It is in fact inevitable that someone, sometime, made that crossing. The real question is not whether the voyage happened, but what was said when the strangers met beneath the rising sun of a new world. If we imagine a speculative theory where Egyptian ideas, such as pyramid building, sacred geometry, or religious symbolism, traveled to Mesoamerica, it's more plausible that these ideas might have traveled via the Phoenicians, if at all. The Phoenicians had the ships and knowledge to cross oceans, centuries of close cultural exchange with Egypt, settled in faraway lands like Malta, Sardinia, and Iberia, and eventually founded Carthage. Thus, if Egyptian cultural seeds ever made it west toward the Atlantic, they may have hitched a ride on Phoenician ships.